All right, Rabosai, good morning. Let us begin. I'm going to begin by thanking our sponsors. Our sponsors for this morning. Sure to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Iyar, Yonah and Shoshi Ehrenfeld for dedicating the Shiurim and Drashos this month in memory of Yonah's grandfather, Yosef ben Shmuel Aaron, Zichron Livracha. Benjamin and Ali Swal of Netanya for dedicating the Shiurim this month in memory of their dear friend and mentor, Moshe Chaim ben Tzvi Hirsch. Our week of learning sponsors, Dr. Shmuel and Rabbi Karapkin, in commemoration of the first yahrzeit of Shmuel's father, Leonard Karapkin Lipa ben Yecheskel HaKohen, and the learning is dedicated this week as well in memory of Police Commando Noam Raz, Hashem Yikom Damo, who has sent out the information yesterday, really incredible, who never missed a day of Daf Yomi. We hope that on the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshamas will have an aliyah and the families a nechama. But with that, let us begin. We really have an incredible daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Ayin Aleph 71, and we are picking up Emir Hashem 2 lines up from the bottom on Ayin Amud Beis 70b Hashtag da Amrit. So remember again, just to provide a little bit of context and a quick review again. We started the new parak yesterday, Baruch Hashem, Mazel Tov on that. And in this parak, we were continuing on, it's interesting, by the way, just the progression of our topics, right? Remember, again, we've been speaking about Truma already for a little while, but the truth is our discussion about Truma really began in the context of marriage, and then, right, what types of marriages allow or preclude Truma consumption that then transitioned into a discussion about what type of relationships, even non-marital relationships, allow for the consumption of truma or preclude it. And now again, in this particular Mishnah, we're talking about from the Kohen perspective himself, what type of personal situation allows for a Kohen to continue to eat truma and what would preclude it. So we'll say, so remember again, so we were specifically focusing on the orel, right? We haven't even really gotten further in the Mishnah. So an individual Kohen who is uncircumcised may not go ahead and eat truma. We had a machlokes as to how we arrive at that conclusion. Where do we know that from? So we'll say we have Rabbi Lazar and Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Lazar, again, just a very quick review. Rabbi Lazar was saying, essentially, it's a gzir shava of toshav v'sachir, toshav v'sachir. It says toshav v'sachir by Pesach, and again, we defined those terms. But just like there's a category of people who can't eat Karban Pesach, and toshav v'sachir included in that category. Now remember, we saw toshav v'sachir by Pesach ultimately again refers to non-Jews. So halacha, just like toshav v'sachir can't eat Karban Pesach, and also by Pesach an RL can't eat Pesach. So too it says toshav and sachir by Truma, and an RL also can't eat Truma. An RL also can't eat Truma. That was the position of Rabbi Lazar. Rabbi Akiva, whose position we'll get into a little bit more today as well, said it's a limud ish. Ish comes to include a group of people who cannot go ahead and partake of consecrated items, and included in that is the RL. Okay, so we'll say that's the background. That's the background. Remember, again, over the course of yesterday, we also did a number of other drashas, which we're going to pick up with today. Hashtag da Amrit, second to last line from the bottom. So hashtag da Amrit bo lidrasha hu da asa. So we'll say now that we said that the word bo, found by Karban Pesach, v'chol evet ish miknas kasef umalta also az yochal bo. Now that we said that bo is used for a drasha, kol ben nechar lo yochal bo lamali. Ultimately, we'll say, why do I need the phrase of kol ben nechar lo yochal bo? To which the Gemara says, this is very interesting. Lamali bo hamara, top of Ayin Aleph, bo hamaras das poselas. Ve'in hamaras das poselas b'maiser. Rabbi said to teach us something really fascinating. That halacha l'maisa, hamaras das. Rabbi said, what is hamaras das? Apikarsus. If somebody does not believe in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, believe in Torah, remembering Rabbi said, the notion of hamaras das also doesn't have to be that a person abandons all faith, but rather a person abandons certain basic tenets of faith. So if a person doesn't believe, a non-believer is not permitted to eat Karban Pesach. Is that fascinating? Not permitted to eat Karban Pesach. Hamaras das poselas, right? Hamaras das, so right, look at Rashi, Hamaras das poselas, tim hemer dato, v'nisnach romasa l'shava shamayim. If a person has given up his faith, himer daito literally means exchanged his faith. He exchanged his faith in HaKadosh Baruch Hu for something else. V'nisnachru, reading Rashi, v'nisnachru masalav shamayim, and his actions have become alien to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Amrachman lo yochabal. The Torah says that ultimately, again, such a person is not permitted to eat Karban Pesach. Interesting. Let's say I'll also point out over here how I think it's fascinating that Rashi understands over here Hamaras Das as two things. There's ultimately, again, Himer Dato. There's like a cognitive piece over here, almost like a spiritual piece over here. I abandon beliefs, and a behavioral piece over here. V'nisnachru ma'asav la'aviv shabashamayim. And my actions themselves become alien. Shabbos says, Hamaras Das precludes one from eating Pesach. And interesting enough, the in Hamaras Das poselas b'maiser. Fascinating. But if halacha l'maisa, and it was here Sima Meiser Sheni or anything else, right? But Hamaras Das will not preclude a person ultimately from eating Meiser. Okay, so I'll say, so I'll point out if we have time, I'll come back to this because there's a fascinating Rambam, because the Rambam says, we'll say this notion that a person, Hamaras Das, can't go ahead and eat Karban Pesach. So interestingly enough, the Rambam understands this more as a prohibition to give such a person Karban Pesach. So I'll say, so for example, if I know that a member of my Chabura has become an apikores, right? Hamaras Das, I would not be permitted to give that person from my Karban Pesach. Because we'll say the notion that that person can eat Karban Pesach, well, if the Isser is on him, if he's an apikores, right, then what? Then what? The Isser is not going to matter all that much to him. The Isser is on other people to provide him with a piece of the Karban Pesach. Okay, so the Gemara says, Kol ora lo yochavo lamali. What do I need the phrase of Kol ora lo yochavo? What does that come to teach me? So the Gemara says, Bo eino ochel aval ochel hu b'matzu u'b'moror. Wow. Rabbi said to teach me what? That halacha l'maisa, the apikores, right? The Hamaras Das individual, he can't eat Karban Pesach. What can he eat? Matzah and maror. What can he matzah and maror? Which I say, by the way, I just want to tell you, is again, there's so much to talk about in these sugyas, which is fascinating. Rabbi said, what is this Gemara an explicit raya for? What is it a raya for? There's a fundamental machlokes by Pesach. Are Pesach, matzah, and maror one mitzvah, or are they independent mitzvahs? Rabbi say, now what is this based on? When the Torah speaks about matzah and maror, what does the Torah say? Al matzos umirorim yochluhu. How do you Karban Pesach? How do you Karban Pesach? With matzah and maror, which I both say gives rise to the Hillel sandwich, korech, right? Korech, you wrap it all together. Hillel's understanding was there's one mitzvah of Pesach, matzah, and maror, and that's why you wrap it together. They're not independent; they are to all be consumed together. It is interesting to see over here how. What does the Gemara say? The Gemara says that the individual who is suffering from Hamaras Das, now there's a condition of Hamaras Das, there's a condition of apikarsus. Some people suffer from it, Rahman al-Islam. So again, if this guy's suffering from Hamaras Das, he can't eat Karban Pesach. What can he eat? He can eat matzah and maror, which would seem to indicate that Allah Chalamaisa what was? They're separate mitzvahs. Okay, just an interesting aside. Vitzrich lemichtav aral, vitzrich lemichtav kol ben nechar. So Rabbi say the truth is, so therefore what we have over here, Rabbi says as follows. What we have over here is, by Pesach, by Karban Pesach, I so far have two exclusions. Well, I have more than two, but we're two that we're learning now. I have aral, someone who's uncircumcised can't eat Karban Pesach, that's one. And then kol ben nechar teaches me that anyone who is, we'll just call it an apikores, even though Rabbi I will point out that Hamaras Das and apikarsus, there can be differences between the two, but again, for our purposes this morning, we're just going to equate them, because I think apikarsus is a little bit more familiar for us in the vernacular. So halacha l'maisa, in the halacha l'maisa, kol ben nechar teaches me that an apikores can't eat Karban Pesach. So why do I need both? The Gemara says, v'yitzrich lemichtav arel, v'yitzrich lemichtav kol ben nechar. Why? Because of Rachmana Arel, had the Torah just told me that an Arel can't eat Karban Pesach, Mishum Demois. I will say we've seen the second already, we've seen so it's yesterday's daf also. An Arel is considered to be Mos. There's something repulsive, there's something disgusting about the uncircumcised individual. I will say, now, what does that mean? The Gemara is saying that the absence of a bris milah represents an absence of a level of physical refinement. So I understand if a person is, if there's a lack of physical refinement, then halacha l'maisa, they can't partake in a carbon, right? There's something physically unrefined about that individual. Aval benechar delo ma'is emolo. I will say about benechar, you see, interesting enough with the apikores, physically he's whole. Right? Physically, he's quote-unquote refined. Physically, he's fine. I might have thought that therefore, halacha l'maisa, he's not excluded. V'i kasev rachmana kol ben ichar mishum den libo l'shamayim. Or Rabbi said the Torah just excluded the apikores. Kol ben ichar. Why? I understand why. Because in libo l'shamayim, Rabbi say what a profound statement. His heart is not with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. His heart is not with Hashem. And therefore, again, that's why he's excluded from Karim Pesach. Aval orel. But Arel, which you're going to say, somebody might be uncircumcised, but Allah Chalamaisa, again, his heart is to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And you'll say to yourself, come on, that doesn't make any sense, right? If you're uncircumcised, how can your heart be to Hashem, right? If your heart was really to Hashem, then what? You'd have a bris milah. I just want to point out, we all live with this. In other words, the notion, a person could not have a bris milah, and okay, in this area he's deficient, but in other areas, he's with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Rabbi say, isn't that the story of our lives? Right? I'm good in some areas, not so good in other areas. But again, just because I'm deficient in certain ways doesn't take away from the fact that the areas in which I am committed, that's a sincere commitment, right? Our Yiddishkeit, right, like any relationship, is not an all or nothing thing. I'm committed to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the areas that I'm committed, and I struggle in the areas that I struggle with. And that's okay. My goal is to become more proficient, to become better in more and more areas each and every day. That's my goal. But Lamaisa, the fact that I'm incomplete, the fact that I'm imperfect, the fact that I struggle in some ways does not take away from the fact that I'm doing really well in other areas. It's not an all or nothing thing. So the Gemara says, I would understand if you would exclude the apikores. He doesn't believe in God. He doesn't believe in God, or at least he thinks he doesn't believe in God, right? His heart is not to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Aval orel, but the orel de libo l'shamayim, his heart is for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? He's with God. He's deficient in this area of bris milah. Got it. That's the story of our lives. Good in some areas, deficient in other areas, but it doesn't take away from the things that I'm doing well. Se'emalo, I would have thought that such an individual should not be excluded. Therefore, it's tzricha. So we'll say, halacha l'maisa. It's really fascinating. So we're beginning to kind of build out the people who are precluded from Karban Pesach. So again, we have Tosha v'Sachir, as those are written explicitly. We saw that already in yesterday's daf. Arel is also written explicitly by Karban Pesach. And now again, Rabbi say, that phrase, Kol Ben Nechar, which the truth is, what does that mean? Who's the Ben Nechar? Rabbi say, just understand, by the way, how do you translate that phrase, Ben Nechar? Son of, right, stranger, right? It could be like Nechar, like Lashon of Nachri, or the son who is estranged. That's how the Gemara seems to really understand it over here. Ben Nechar is the son who is estranged. Who is the son who is estranged? Hamoras das. Apikarsus. He also doesn't ikar in Pesach. Beautiful. Not beautiful, but you understand. Says the Gemara. Mimenu lamali. What do I do with the word mimenu? Now, what are we referencing here? So we'll say, the pasuk is, Atochlu mimenu na ubashal avushal b'mayim kim tzli'esh al kra'av al kirbav v'lo sasiru mimenu. We'll say, the Torah seems to use the word mimenu, from it, repeatedly, right? Do not eat from it cooked, right? Rather, it has to be roasted. Do not leave over from it until morning. And if you leave over from it until the morning, we have to burn it. So we'll say, the word mimenu, from it, is repeated multiple times. And to be honest, doesn't really seem necessary. So why do I need the word mimenu? Mimenu la'amali l'chidra ba'amar Rabbi Yitzchak. So we'll say that drasha we're actually going to discuss. Rashi points out over here, l'kamon ayin dalid amadal. So we'll say in a couple of days from now, we will see the drasha regarding mimenu. Okay, so we're going to shelve that for now. Amar Mar, Rabbi Akiva, Omer Eino Tzarach. So we'll say, so remember, Up until now, our entire discussion has been focused on the position of Rabbi Lazar, right? Rabbi Lazar, also remember again, we've only gotten, this whole time, we've only been through the first word in the Mishnah, right? The Mishnah, going through the list of people who cannot eat Truma, says the Orel. So this entire time we've been focusing on how do I know that an Orel can't eat Karban Pesach. That's what we've been hyper-focused on. So Rabbi will say, and what's the answer to that? The answer to that is that Gervatoshav, and we kind of built that out. Now we're transitioning to the position of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva says this whole drasha is not necessary. You don't need this whole thing of Gervatoshav, this, that. Rabbi Akiva says the Gzir Shava is not necessary to learn the Isser of Orel by Truma. Where does he learn it from? So the Gemara says, Harihu Omer Ish L'Rabos Es HaOrel. The pasuk says Ish, and Ish is coming to include the Orel. Good. Rabbi say, by the way, the pasuk that he's referencing over here is Ish Mizera Aaron Vutzarua Ozav Bakadoshim Lo Yochal Adash Yitar. So Rabbi say the Torah actually here is talking about, interestingly enough, if a person is a Tsarua, has Saras, a person is a Zov, meaning a person is Tameh. If a person is Tameh, he cannot go ahead and partake of anything consecrated or sacrificial. Rabbi Akiva's drasha is the word Ish is coming to include other people in this precluded status. Who else is coming to be included? The Arel, the person who's uncircumcised. He too cannot participate or cannot partake of other sacrificial items, or I should say consecrated items, namely Truma as well. Incredible. I have a Rabbi says So Rabbi said the Gemara now is going to go through the same exercise with Rabbi Akiva that we went through with Rabbi Lazar in yesterday's daf. It's really fascinating. Rabbi Akiva, how do you know that Ish comes to include an Arel, someone uncircumcised? Maybe it comes to include an Onain, someone who suffered a loss in the immediate aftermath of the loss before burial. Maybe he can't eat Truma. To which Rabbi Chanina, Amar Kra, V'chol Zar. No, because you're supposed to say, when it comes ultimately again to the inability to eat items that are Kodesh, the Torah frames that prohibition in someone who is a Zar. Someone who's a Zar. So the Gemara says, Zoros amarti lecha v'lo aninos. We only preclude someone who falls under the category of Zaros, but not Aninos. Says the Gemara, I don't understand. Ima v'lo arelos. So why don't you just say the same thing? That Zar, only a Zar is not permitted to eat Truma, or a Kadshim, I should say, but someone who is an Arel is permitted to eat it. Haksiv Ish. The Gemara says, no, for arelos, we have the drush of Ish. The Gemara says, you're not answering my question. Uma rois. I will say, the word Ish is totally nondescript. I got it. Rabbi Akiva is saying the word Ish comes to include more people in the prohibition to go ahead and eat consecrated items. Rabbi Akiva is using that to teach me that an Arel can't eat Truma. The Gemara says, okay, maybe it comes to also exclude an Onain. No, not Aninos, because Zaros, not Aninos. Okay, why don't you say Zaros and not Arelos? Oh, because Ish teaches you. Again, it's circular logic. So in other words, Ish I will say is nondescript. How do you know that Ish teaches you or teaches you an Arel any more than an Onain? To which the Gemara says, how do you know that Ish comes to include an Arel in the prohibition and not an Onain? Mistabra Arelos, Havilei Rabuye. It makes more sense that an Arel would be included in the prohibition. Why? Shekein ma'asim krusim b'davar ha'avid. We'll say this refers. This is the way to remember all of the items that we mentioned in yesterday's daf that show you how an Arel is more chomer than anything else. Namely, mechusar ma'isa. Number one, again, an Arel is missing an action. In other words, he's missing an action of bris milah. U'maise begufo. The action is something that impacts his body. Va'anosh kares, it carries with the penalty of kares. V'yeshno lefnei adibor, and the mitzvah of milah was given even before Matan Torah. Umilas zecharav va'avodav ma'akeves. And again, I will say having uncircumcised slaves would prevent you from bringing Karban Pesach. So I will say these are all the ways in which you see that the mitzvah of milah is really more chomer than anything else. And the fact that mitzvah of milah has all of these chumras would seem to indicate to us what? Would seem to indicate that halacha l'maisa it should be included in ish. Adrabah. The Gemara will say, so again, just listen to what's happening over here. Rabbi Akiva, very simple. Rabbi Akiva makes a drasha, ish. Ish comes to include additional people in the prohibition to consume truma. Rabbi Akiva says, who's included in ish? Who's included? An RL. All the Gemara is saying is, how do you know to include an RL and not to include an onain? To which the Gemara answers, because RL is more chamer. How is RL more chamer? All of the reasons we just mentioned. To which the Gemara says, I can argue just the opposite. Adrabah, aninos havi le'lerabuye. No, I could tell you that I think you should include an onain more than an RL. Why? Listen to this, Rabbi say, why? Shekein yeshna b'chol shah. Number one, Rabbi say, aninos applies all the time. What does the Rabbi say? The next sugya we're going to get to, which is really so fascinating. Rabbi say, let me ask you this question. Is a child under the age of 8 days considered to be an RL or not? Now, I will say, in other words, there's no mitzvah of bris milah until day 8. So is a child before the 8th day an RL? So this is going to be a discussion, but we're going to see an opinion that says, no. The status of arelos only applies to someone who has a mitzvah of milah, which means I will say that there is a time in which there may not be a din of RL. Onain is a status that applies all the time. Furthermore, it applies to men and women, right? As opposed to obviously RL only applies to men. I will say this is so profound. Aninos, I will say, what can you do to remedy your aninos status? What can you do? Nothing. As opposed to arelos, what can you do? Right? Give yourself bris milah. In other words, you could organize, which I will say so profound. The Gemara says, isn't there a fundamental distinction between a situation in which you could remedy yourself versus a situation that you can't remedy yourself? To which the Gemara says, so therefore I will say, the Gemara says, so therefore I can just as easily make the argument that ish should come to include RL because RL has its own set of chumras, to which the Gemara says, hanach nefishin. It's true, but there are more chumras associated with RL. An interesting argument, right? Even more chumras associated with RL. To which the Gemara says, Rava Amar, below hanach nefishin, nami lo matzes amrit. The truth is, even if RL didn't have more chumras, you still couldn't include onain over RL. Right now, why not? Amar ish, because the Gemara says ish. Eiz, or say ish means a man, and it says it twice. What is something that applies to a man and doesn't apply to a woman? Have omer ze arelos, being an RL. So therefore I will say, not halacha l'maisa, but I will say this is now the second part of this argument. Now we have both sides. This is the drasha of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva says, how do we know that halacha l'maisa and RL can't eat truma? From the ribui of ish. Ish comes to include Rabbi. So again, just understand context. The pasuk of ish is not talking about truma per se. It's talking about ish, any man, any kohen who is tameh because of tsaras, because of zav, can't eat anything consecrated. Rabbi Akiva says true, but the word ish comes to include additional people. Who are the additional people additional person being included? RL. RL can't eat truma because truma is a consecrated item. Again, we tried to include onain, we rejected that. Good. For Rabbi Akiva, so I'll say, so now here's what's interesting. So now we're going to go back and kind of do the same thing to Rabbi Akiva that we did to Rabbi Lazar in yesterday's daf. So I'll say, I just want to point out, Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Lazar are not disagreeing on the bottom line halacha. What's the bottom line halacha? An RL can't eat truma. What do they disagree about? The mechanism through which you arrive at that conclusion. Rabbi Akiva is learning it out from ish. Ultimately, Rabbi Lazar is learning it out from ger v'soshav, the gzera shava. And I will say, so what's interesting about this is the mechanism which you use has other ramifications because the limud is different, as we're going to see. Rabbi Akiva, hi toshav v'zakir my avidlei. So it's very exciting. So what does Rabbi Akiva do with ger v'toshav? Right? Remember again. Sorry, not ger v'toshav. Toshav v'zakir. I will say, so remember again. This is by Karban Pesach. See, Rabbi Lazar used toshav v'sachar for what? To establish the gzera shava, the halachic bridge between Pesach and Truma. Rabbi Akiva doesn't need any of that. So what does Rabbi Akiva do with the phrase, or how does he understand the phrase, Soshav B'Sachir? Here we go. So I'm Rav Shmaya, La'asuye is fantastic. La'asuye, Aravi Mahul, V'Givoni Mahul. Rabbi say comes to include, if you have a circumcised Arab or a circumcised Givoni, these individuals are not permitted to eat Karban Pesach. Rabbi say that halacha l'maisa, even if you have a non-Jew who is circumcised, they're still not allowed to eat Karban Pesach. Because remember again, by Toshav and Sachir, the Torah says, Toshav v'Sachir lo yochal bo. Right? So Toshav and Sachir can't eat Karban Pesach. So who are, and we don't know who are the Toshav and the Sachir. Who are they? Who are they? So again, Rabbi Akiva will say, they are circumcised Gentiles. Rashi says over, look at Rashi, Lasui Aravi v'Givoni Mahol Shalo Yochal b'Pesach. See, even though Rabbi said, listen to this. Now, what is Rabbi Akiva saying? It's fascinating. Even though these individuals both are not what? What are they not? They're not an Orel. They're not an Orel. Nevertheless, they can't eat Karban Pesach. To which the Gemara says, V'hani molininu. Is that true? That do we look at these individuals as circumcised? In other words, do we look at them ultimately again as being mulin, as being circumcised? Both say, listen to this. It's just so fascinating. Tonight we learned, Konem sha'ani nene le'arelim. So both say, let's say like this. I make a neder that I'm not going to get benefits from anyone who's uncircumcised. Okay? Right? I'm not going to get benefits from anyone who's an Arel. So what's talacha? Mutar be'er ele Yisrael v'asr b'moli ovdei kol chavim. You can get benefit from uncircumcised Jews, and you can't get benefit from circumcised Gentiles. Rabbi say, what do you see from here? What do you see from here? You see from here that halacha l'maisa, the status of Orel versus Mohol is actually not a physiological thing, but rather, again, is a theological thing. That a Jew is considered to be mal, right? And a guy is considered to be an Orel. So now both say, the truth is, this is, remember, I want to point out something very interesting over here. The most important thing in the world of Nidarim, Rabbi say, is what? Right? The klal by Nidarim is, B'Nidarim, halach achar lashon b'nei adam. Rabbi say, when it comes to Nidarim, the way we define a neder is by the way people colloquially speak. So often, again, a guy will be referred to as an Orel. We find that in the Torah. God will be referred to as, non-Jew will be referred to as an Orel, right? So therefore, again, interestingly enough, it's not as much a physiological state as it is a theological state. So I will say that, but the point the Gemara is making over here is we already see that a Nochri who is circumcised is still considered to be quote unquote an Orel. The Gemara says, Konim shani Lemulin. Let's listen to this. If I make a neder, I'm not going to get hana from anyone who has a bris milah. So mutar b'moli ovdei kochavim va'aseh ba'arel Yisrael. You're permitted to get benefit from a guy who has a bris milah, but also to get benefit ultimately from uncircumcised Jews. So we'll say, you see over here, uncircumcised Jew is still called namol. It's still called circumcised. Because again, it refers more to categories of people than it does ultimately, again, to actual circumcision versus non-circumcision. So therefore, I will say, it can't be. So we'll say, we wanted to say Rabbi Akiva is using Sosha v'Sachir to teach you that even a guy who has a bris milah can't eat Karban Pesach. Of course, a guy who has a bris milah can't eat Karban Pesach. In other words, what's the shaila? Karban Pesach is only consumable by Jews. Of course, an Achri can't do it. Whether he has a bris milah, it doesn't make any sense. Tushimar says, you're right. Ela asuye ger shemal v'lo taval. Wow. V'katan shenolad kishu mo. Rabbi say, here we go. Rather, according to Rabbi Akiva, what does Toshav v'Sachir come to include? Remember again, when we say come to include, Toshav v'Sachir is coming to include additional people who cannot eat Karban Pesach. So who else can't eat Karban Pesach? I will say a ger who had bris but didn't go to the mikvah. So he had bris milah, didn't get to go to the mikvah, or a child who was born uncircumcised. Circumcised. The kasavar, that Rabbi Akiva holds. So first of all, Rabbi Akiva holds that halacha l'maisa gerus is only complete after what? Milah and tvilah. So if you just have milah by itself without tvilah, ultimately, again, the conversion is not complete. Similarly, Rabbi Akiva holds, right? Rabbi Akiva holds that Allah will say if a child is born circumcised, there still must be what's called hatavas damris. You have to draw blood from the makom milah. From the makom milah. So therefore, Rabbi say, according to Rabbi Akiva, Toshav Asecha comes to tell you that if you have a convert or a person in the process of conversion and he had milah but he didn't have tevilah, he's not Jewish, can't eat Karban Pesach. Or if you have a katan who was born with a bris, well, was born circumcised, not really born, we don't call it born with a bris, born circumcised. Again, if you do not do atafas dam bris, he cannot eat from Karban Pesach. To which the Gemara says, Rabbi Elazar, supposed to be Rabbi Akiva. That's Rabbi Akiva holds that Allah Alamaisa has learned that from Toshav Asakir. I, Rabbi Elazar, what do you do? Rabbi Eliezer Latame, Da Amar, Ger Shema Velo Taval, Ger Ma'al Yehu. Wow. Rabbi Elazar says, so what does Rabbi Eliezer do? So Rabbi Eliezer says, no, a ger who had milah without tefillah is a bona fide ger. Is a bona fide ger, which Rabbi Eliezer says is pretty amazing. According to Rabbi Eliezer, he holds that actually tevilah is not necessary for gerus. All that's required for gerus is milah and kabbalas hamitzvos, right? Acceptance of mitzvahs, but you don't need tevilah. Furthermore, ultimately, the kasavar katan kishnol ma'u ein tzarich latif meno dambris. He also holds that halacha l'maisa, if a child is born circumcised, you don't need dambris. You don't need dambris. So therefore, I will say, interestingly enough, according to Rabbi Eliezer, he doesn't need toshav asar. Rabbi Eliezer, hi ish. So we'll say, so again, this is very exciting. So he will say, if we round out Rabbi Akiva's shita, here's really what we have. According to Rabbi Akiva, he'll learn out the prohibition for an arel to go ahead and eat truma from where? From where? Ish. That's Rabbi Akiva. What does he do with toshav v'sachir? Toshav v'sachir comes to tell me that even a person in the process of conversion who had milah but didn't have tevilah cannot eat from Karban Pesach. Similarly, a katan, a child who was born circumcised, if he didn't have hatafas dam bris, can't eat Karban Pesach. The Gemara just brings in here, by the way, as an aside, those two pieces of information are points of contention. Rabbi Eliezer, on the other hand, holds that all you need for conversion is milah, kabbalah, so you don't need tevilah in a mikvah. Furthermore, he holds that a katan who's born circumcised does not need hatafas dam bris. Good. Rabbi Eliezer, hi ish my avid le. So we'll say now we're circling back to Rabbi Eliezer. What does Rabbi Eliezer do with ish? To which, because remember again, Rabbi Eliezer learns everything out from toshav v'sachir. What does he do with ish? To which the Gemara says, my avid le dibra tor kolashal manei adam. Hey, that was easy. He holds it's not a drasha. It's not a drasha. The Torah phrases itself in the way that people colloquially speak. So people say, that's how people say, ish, good, all right? We'll say, now we come to a fascinating sugya. So we'll say, that closes out. So we'll say, hopefully you have a mastery now over that machlokes. Again, we always love machloksim like this, because lamaisa, no one's arguing on the conclusion. The conclusion is, an aral can't eat truma. How do I get there? Rabbi Eliezer ultimately saying, tosha v'sachar, gzer shava, between truma and Pesach. Rabbi Akiva ultimately saying it's learned out from ish, agreeing on the bottom line, and again, they each have their respective shitos which flow from that. Beautiful. Here we go. Bar Rav Chaim bar Ukva. Here we go. Katan arel ma'ulusocha b'shemen shel truma. Listen to this case. Well, I just alluded to this before. Here we go. Kohen has a baby. Mazel tov. Has a baby. The baby is we'll call it 6 days old. Okay, so now both say, now the Kohen has truma. What is a Kohen allowed to do with truma? What is he allowed to do with truma? Anything he wants. So Allah said now, respectful uses. Now he has oil of truma oil. He wants to smear his baby with oil. This is often done, right? He wants to smear his baby with oil. So Allah, is he permitted to go ahead and smear his 6-day-old baby with oil? Now both say, what's the shaila? 6-day-old baby obviously doesn't have what? A bris milah. But at the age of 6 days, is the baby considered to be an arel or not? We just established an arel is not permitted to get benefit from truma. So can a Kohen use truma oil on his 6-year-old baby? I will say an incredible shaila. To which the Gemara says, here we go. Katan arel malasach b'shem shel truma arelos shelo bizmano ma'akva olo ma'akva. So we'll say the way the Gemara learns the lashon over here is arelos shelo bizmano, which is another way of saying. I will say, when does a child acquire the status of an orel? Do we say the moment you're born into this world and you don't have a bris, you're an Orel. Or no, from 1 day to 8 days, or from 1 day through 7 days, you can't have a bris. Right? So therefore, you're not an Orel. Orel is a function of someone who's uncircumcised. You only become uncircumcised when there's a mitzvah of circumcision. Or, so I will say, so that's the machlokis. Do we say, the Gemara calls it Arelos Shelo Bizmano, right? An Orel when there is not, do we call you an Orel when there is not yet a mitzvah of bris milah? So here we go, boss. Tashma, Ainli Elam Milas Zechara B'Shas Asiyah. So boss, it's actually fascinating. So I only know, boss, I have a Korban Pesach. I only know that halacha l'maisa, we established that by Korban Pesach, so having uncircumcised males in your home, be it your children or your avadim, precludes you from offering up Korban Pesach. So only elam milas zechara b'shas asiyah, I only know that halacha l'maisa, I can't offer up the Korban Pesach if I have uncircumcised members of my home. Rabbi says, asiyah, offering the Korban Pesach. The Gemara says, "Va'avadav b'shas achila," and I know that if I have uncircumcised avadim, I can't eat Korban Pesach. So again, if you look at Rashi, ainly la'akev b'Pesach ela milas zecharav sheish lo b'shas asiyah, the gabe milas zecharav ksiv v'az yikrav la'asoso v'hainu shchita, the gabe avadav ksiv az yochabo. So we'll say this is very interesting. The Torah phrases it in a fascinating way. If I have uncircumcised children, that precludes me from shechting Korban Pesach. If I have uncircumcised avadim, that precludes me from eating Korban Pesach. That's just the way the Torah phrases the prohibitions. How do I know? Minayin litin esa amar shal zeh bazeh v'esa amar shal zeh bazeh. We'll say, how do I know to apply one to the other? In other words, we'll say, how do I also know that the presence of uncircumcised slaves will preclude me from shechting, and the presence of uncircumcised children will prevent me from eating? The Gemara says, Tambalomar, az l'gzera shava. So I will say, so therefore again, here we go, just understand what we just established. What we just established, I will say, is whether you have uncircumcised avadim at the time of shchita, or uncircumcised children at the time of achila, you can't eat Korban Pesach, which also tells me that what? Even if I didn't have uncircumcised children at the time of shchita, but now I have uncircumcised children at the time of achila, I can't eat. Similarly, if I didn't have uncircumcised avadim at the time of shchita, but now I have them by achila, I also can't eat. So the Gemara says, okay, let's analyze this. I understand that there could be a case, listen to this, there could be a case where I didn't have an uncircumcised eved at the time of shchita, but now I do have him at the time of achila. How could that happen? You just bought him. Right? The Gemara says, "This Zamninu Beini." We'll say first white line on the bottom. We'll say it's very simple. I bought him in between the time of shchita and the time of achila. So I didn't have an uncircumcised eved at the time of shchita, but now I do have an uncircumcised eved at the time of achila. And so the Torah Kedosha tells you, by the way, even though you shechted your Pesach totally beheter, if you have an uncircumcised eved in your house, you cannot eat your Korban Pesach. Ela Zacharov. The isnu b'shas achila, v'lesnu b'shas asiyah, heichi mishkachasla. I will say, how do you ever have a child who is not an orel at the time of shchita, but is an orel at the time of achila? So it must be lav the isyalid ben achila ben asiyah la'achila. We will say, what has to be the case? The case is where Baruch Hashem Mazel Tov, I had a baby in between the time of shchita and the time of achila. So I didn't have the child at the time of shchita. Now I have the child at the time of achila. I will say, how old is the child at that time of achila? A couple of hours old. And yet, what do you see from here? Even a child who's a couple of hours old is considered to be what? An arel. Shmamina arelos shelo bismana havi arelos. So I will say, you see from here that even a child below the age of 8 days, where he can't have a bris milah, is still called an arel, which I will say is fascinating. Because according to this Gemara, what does it sound like? By anyone who has a boy less than the age of 8 days old is not allowed to what? Eat Korban Pesach, which would be an impossible reality. So therefore, we're not finished. Amar Rava says, no, I don't think so. V'tizbara himolo kol zachar amar Rachmana va'az yakrav laso. So we'll say the pasuk says by Korban Pesach, the pasuk says, "Michi yagar itcha ger va'asa Pesach laHashem himol lo kol zachar va'az yikrav laso." So we'll say, so again, Torah speaking about the ger, when the ger ultimately wants to join for Korban Pesach, Torah says, no problem, make sure as a bris milah, and the ger could join you. So the Gemara says, I v'hai lav bar milahu. But we'll say, how can you possibly say that halacha l'maisa, a baby that's not yet 8 days old, would preclude you from eating Korban Pesach? The baby is not subject to the laws of milah. In other words, we'll say, the Gemara is pushing back and saying, arelos is a state of someone who is derelict in performing the mitzvah. But the child less than 8 days doesn't have the mitzvah. So we'll say, but here's the problem. Here's the problem. We want to accept the premise that a child less than 8 days old cannot be an oral. Can't be an oral if less than 8 days old. The problem is also, we also have to come up with a case of what? Of a child who was not an oral at the time of shchita, but is an oral at the time of achila. That's what we're looking. We're just looking for that case. What is the possible case? To which the Gemara says, I'll tell you the case. Right. I'll say, what's the case? The case where the baby had a fever. Look at Rashi. We'll say, here's the case. The baby was sick. Baby had a fever. So 8 days old. The baby's 8 days old. 8 days old on Erev Pesach. I'm ready to do the bris milah, right? What happens if he gets a fever? So at the time that I shechted the Korban Pesach, remember, if a baby has a fever, then what? No, you don't do milah, baby's a chola. Okay, now allowed to do a milah, baby's a chola. So now at the time of the shechita, the baby had a fever, the baby was a chola, so I couldn't do bris milah. Then I will say, what happened? After shechita, what happened? The fever broke. So ideally, what am I supposed to do? Give the bris milah then. If at the time of achila, I have not given the baby a bris milah, then halacha l'maisa, that baby is an aral. If baby is an aral, that precludes him from eating Korban Pesach. One second, that's not true. V'neisav le'kol shiva. Damar Shmuel chatzas ochama nosel chashabos. We're going to see this sugya. Halacha l'maisa. We'll say when the baby is sick and then recovers, you don't just do bris milah right away. In other words, especially with a fever, the Gemara says you give the baby 7 days to recover. So we'll say, if that's true, that the baby had a fever at the time of the shechita, and the fever broke right afterwards, you still wouldn't give that baby a bris milah. And if that's the case, the baby is not an oral. If the baby is not an oral, then you could eat Korban Pesach. The Gemara says, so I'll say, so what's the case? The case, so I'll say, is where the baby did have a fever, right? And now Korban Pesach Erev Pesach is the day that the baby should have had the bris milah. To which the Gemara says, okay, so then why not go ahead and give the baby the bris milah already the morning of the 8th day? The morning of Erev Pesach. In other words, we're switching it around. Now really Erev Pesach was the 7th day, or I should say the day after the 7th day, the 8th day from the recovery. So give the baby a bris milah in the morning, to which the Gemara says, Ba'inon amud beis, ba'inon me'es la'es. They both say this is fascinating. They both say when it comes to a baby who is ill, we're going to get into this sugya. When it comes to a baby who is ill, we give the baby a certain recovery period before we do bris milah. We will not do bris milah until there's a recovery period. The interesting part about that recovery period, I will say, is it's not 7 calendar days of recovery. It's what? 7 24-hour periods. So I will say, let's say, for example, so if the baby recovers at Tuesday at 6:30 a.m., we count 7 24-hour periods from there. So therefore, I will say, it could be that the case is where halacha l'maisa, the 8th day falls out a little bit later. So it could very well be, also you could have a case where the 8th day, right, fell out on Erev Pesach, but let's say fell out after the time of Shechita. So you could have a case where halacha l'maisa, a person had a more than 8-day-old child that was uncircumcised at the time of Shechita, which is fine because the baby was still quote unquote in the window of illness. But halacha l'maisa, by the time you come to Achila, would require a milah, and if doesn't have milah, would preclude the father from eating Korban Pesach. The Gemara says, 1 second, Vatani loda, Yom Hibaraso, Kiyom Hivaldo. So I will say, ultimately, again, the day that you're born is just like the day, the day that you're healed is like the day that you're born. How so? My love, Yom Hivaldo Loba Ina Me'es Leis. So I will say, don't we say that in general by Bris Milah, right? By Bris Milah, we'll say the halacha is that what? We give a Bris Milah 8th day. Now we'll say, how do we count 8 days? How do you count 8 days? Calendar days. In other words, we'll say, if a baby is born, 1 minute before Shkia, right? 1 minute before sunset, 1 day. That's 1 day. So we'll say, the fact that we're now comparing days of recovery to days of birth, don't we say that just like days of birth, we count calendar days, so too by recovery, we also count calendar days, to which the word is low, but me'es la'es. And I will say, when it comes to recovery, we don't count calendar days, we count 24 periods. Lo adif yom hibarasa miyom hivaldo. Yom hivaldo lo b'ina me'es la'es. I will say, when it comes to when a baby is born, and you want to count days for bris milah, we don't require, we'll say, me'es la'es means 24-hour periods. We don't require 24-hour periods, but rather, again, we look at calendar days. V'ilu yom hivarasol, but me'es la'es. So we'll say, but again, when it comes to recovery does require 24-hour periods. So we'll say, so I just want to be clear what we're doing over here. It appears that the Gemara is settled on the fact that a baby less than 8 days old is not an RL. Which was going back to our original question. Remember, how did this all start? Could a Kohen take truma oil and smear his 6-day-old baby? And the answer would appear to be yes. Now, I will say, that great. Put that on the side for now. The problem we just got into now is the Gemara in the Brisa described the case, told us that a Kohen who had a baby who was, or not a Kohen, a person, Erev Pesach, a person who had a child who's not an RL at the time of Shechita, right? So he was able to shet the Karban Pesach, but then the child becomes an RL at the time of Achila. That RL child will preclude his father from eating Karban Pesach. So what are we trying to figure out over here? How can you not be an RL at the time of Shechita, but then become an RL at the time of Achila? So we've had one example. So far, one answer. What's the one answer? Where the baby had a fever. The fever broke, you waited 7 days, right? The 8th day, which would have been the Milah day, ultimately, again, is on Erev Pesach. The 24 hours did not yet conclude at the time of Shechita, but it concluded after the time of Shechita before Achila. So that could be a case of where the baby wasn't an RL at the time of Shechita, but now is an RL, and if you don't take care of the Arelis before Achila, would preclude the father from eating. Another answer, Papa Amar, Kigon dekoiv le'ene li'yenuka, v'itbach beni beni. Papa says it could be a case of where the baby had problem with his eyes. So I will say, an eye problem is not the type of illness that you have to give a 7-day recovery period. Eye problem, as long as the baby is healed, you're good to go. So what's the case? At the time of Shechita, the baby had an eye problem, which again says you can't do Milah. Therefore, again, he's not an RL. If you can't do Milah, you're not an RL, right? But the eyes were healed, Baruch Hashem, between Shechita and Achila. So now the father would be obligated to go ahead and give the baby a Milah. And if he doesn't do so, the Arelus of the child would preclude the father from eating Karban Pesach. Beautiful. Rava Amarava says, what's the case? This is the case. Let's say father and mother, it's quite a power couple, right? Both parents, right, are incarcerated. So both say they were. So now remember again. So they're part of a chabura. So someone shechted Karban Pesach for them, right? Part of the chabura, and therefore because they're incarcerated, they can't do milah. They're let out of jail after the Zman of Shechita. Now they can do Milah. So again, at this point, they become Chayiv. A failure to do so will mean that they have a child who is an RL, because we'll say the mitzvah is on the parents. So therefore, again, failure to do so will preclude them from eating. So we'll say all just cases of where, technically speaking, the child is not an RL at the time of Shechita, but is an RL by the time of Achila. Next example, or next explanation of Rav Kana B'Rav Nechemia Amar, Kigon tumtum shenikra v'nimtza zachar beni beni. Interesting case. And we'll say, what's the case? Where the baby was a tumtum. We'll say, what's a tumtum? Tumtum is a child where the sexual organs are covered over by a membrane. So we don't know male or female. And we'll say, what's the case? At the time of Shechita, the baby was still a tumtum. Then what happens? The membrane ruptured after Shechita, and Mazel Tov, you discover it's a boy. It's a boy. Now we'll say, and obviously more than 8 days have elapsed. So at this point in time now, there is an obligation to go ahead and do bris milah. Incredible. So the Gemara says, good. Rav Sharvia Amar Kigon Shahotzi is an interesting one. Shahotzi Rosho Chutz Lepruzdar. So we'll say, what's the case? Rav Sharvia says the case is where the baby extended his head outside of the birth canal. So they extended. We'll say, now what's the case? If we look at Rashi, Shahotzi Vlad Rosho Chutz Lepruzdar. Ukvar avru shiva yamim. So listen to this. The case over here is where the baby went ahead and was partially born, so extended his head outside of the birth canal. And I will say, once the head, here's what's interesting. Once the head comes out, the baby is considered born. You don't even need the full head. I'll say the truth is it's either padachto, the forehead, or it has to be over here, the forehead and the nose, so the baby could breathe. Right? So ultimately, again, once the forehead and, once the head comes, we'll call it just the head. Once the head comes out, halacha lamaisa, again, the baby is considered to be born. So the Gemara says, look at Rashi. Shotzi Vlad Rosho Chutz Leprozdar, Ukvar Avru Shiva Yamim, 7 days. So the baby is in that state for 7 days. For 7 days. Umeahi shaita havele Vlad the Kamal Meseches Nida Yatsa Rosh Sharei Kilod Vahashta Ben Asiya Lachil Yatsa Guf Tavle Zvamila. Both say, okay, so listen to this case. Here's the case. The case is where the head came out. Baby's been like that for 7 days. So now both say comes out of Pesach. It's day 8. The baby is chayv mila. Can't do a mila obviously because the head is the body is inside of the mother. When is the baby fully birthed? After Shechita, after Shechita basis. Well, say here's a case of where halacha l'maisa again, mila could not be done. Mila could not be done. Ultimately, again, during the zman of Shechita, can be done now post Shechita, and that mila ultimately again would be ma'akev. To which the Gemara says, just as an aside, umi chaye, could a child live like that? Right? Could a child survive for 7 days in that state? Vatanya, we learned. We'll say once a child is born, you know what happens? That which is closed, I should say, that which is open becomes closed, and that which is closed becomes open. In other words, I will say that Allah said once a child is born, again, there's a physiological shift. So how can a baby even survive like that? I will say, how is the baby sustained? The baby is sustained ultimately through a fever. I will say, this is an incredible idea. Now, here's the problem. You're not feeding this baby. How is the baby sustained? Through a fever. I will say, because it's very interesting that in the eyes of Chazal, a fever sustains an individual. It sustains an individual by ultimately, again, raising body temperature, obviously, and also diminishing appetite. So because of that, the child is able to be sustained through fever. So Gemara says, Ishta deman, whose fever? Whose fever? If it's the baby's fever, shiva boy. I will say, we just said before, if baby has a fever, then what do? You give the baby an additional 7 days once the fever breaks. So then this child is not subject to mila at all, even when he comes out of Kara Pesach between Shechita and Achila. Ela dezinsa ishta diime. It must be, it's the fever of the mother. The fever of the mother is sustaining the child. The other possibility is, Hani milihecha de la ma'avi. I will say, ultimately, again, when do we say the child is unable to live? When the child is not crying. But if the child is crying being a sign of vitality, ultimately, again, okay, so we'll say, so therefore, again, halacha, so good. We'll say, these are all just extreme examples of how halacha, you could have a situation of a child who was not subject to milah at the time of shechita, but does become subject to milah ultimately by the time of achila. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan Aram Makabel Hazah. So says it's an interesting sugi. Actually, we'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up with this Gemara tomorrow. But I will say we'll pick up with the fact that in other situations, being an Aral, we've discussed what an Aral precludes you from. And Mir Hashem in tomorrow's daf, we'll see that even as an Aral, certain other sacrificial processes are still going to be permitted. I will say beautiful sugi a lot of Agaraton Gemara Mir Hashem tomorrow's Shkoyach. All right, have a great day, everyone. Dr. Lussman, Moshe Ben Sion, Eretz Yisrael contingent, enjoy. Great day, everyone. What can't happen? I'm sorry?